My name is Annalise Thorne, and I am 32 years old. For most of my life, I was a ghost, a shadow deliberately cast by my own family to make my sister shine all the brighter. They thought they could dim my light forever, but they never imagined that the most elaborate deception of my life would lead me to the truest version of myself. They never dreamed that the man my family was desperate for my sister to marry would end up spending an entire season searching for a mysterious woman in a mask, a ghost that was me all along. The greatest irony is that in trying to make me invisible, they made me unforgettable. Before I dive into how a silk mask and a borrowed gown unraveled a lifetime of suppression and led to a confrontation that shook the highest levels of society, I want to connect with all of you listening today. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always so wonderful to see how far these stories travel. And if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or invisible in your own life, please hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. For all the new viewers, if you believe in the power of finding your own voice, I hope you'll subscribe to join this incredible community of people who understand. Our family home, Thorne Manor, was a meticulously curated stage, and my mother, Lady Beatrice, was its tireless director. Every curtain, every piece of polished silver, every social call was orchestrated with a single-minded purpose: the advancement of the Thorne name through my older sister, Cassandra. Cassandra was the production star, the designated diamond of the season, a title my mother had been polishing since my sister was old enough to curtsy. She was undeniably beautiful. With hair like spun gold and eyes the color of a summer sky, she was everything society adored. My mother ensured it. Cassandra's gowns were the envy of every debutante. Her wit was sharpened by the finest tutors, and her charm was practiced daily in front of our drawing room mirror. And I was the stage dressing, the muted backdrop designed to make the star's brilliance seem almost divine. You see, the family had a secret, a complication that interfered with my mother's grand design. I was also beautiful, in a different way perhaps. Where Cassandra was golden sunshine, I was quiet moonlight, with dark wavy hair that fell to my waist and eyes the color of moss after a rainstorm. We looked enough alike that side by side in equal finery, a comparison would have been inevitable. And for my mother, comparison was a risk she would not tolerate. It might divide the attention. It might make a potential suitor pause and think, which was the last thing she wanted. She wanted them to be so dazzled by Cassandra they wouldn't think at all. So a verdict was handed down when I turned 16. It wasn't a loud, dramatic declaration, but a quiet, insidious reprogramming of my existence. My wardrobe was purged of all color, replaced with a symphony of drab grays, washed-out beiges, and oppressive browns. My wonderful thick hair was to be scraped back at all times into a severe, tight bun that pulled at my temples and gave me a perpetual headache. The most ingenious cruelty, however, was the glasses. My eyesight was perfect, a fact confirmed by the family doctor, but my mother procured a pair of spectacles with thick, unflattering frames and plain glass lenses. "They make you look more studious," she'd said, a thin smile playing on her lips. What she meant was, they made me look plain. They broke the lines of my face, hid the shade of my eyes, and served as a constant physical reminder of my designated role. To complete the transformation, I was instructed on how to act. I was to be meek. My voice was to be kept soft, my opinions non-existent. I was to walk with my gaze lowered, to fade into the wallpaper, to be a pleasant but forgettable footnote in the story of my sister. I became Cassandra's companion, her shadow, the quiet girl who carried her wrap, fetched her forgotten fan, and listened with a placid expression as others sang her praises. The most painful part was that Cassandra accepted this arrangement without question. She wasn't overtly cruel. There were no pinched arms or whispered taunts in the dark. In her own way, I think she loved me. But she was a flower that had been raised in a hothouse, and she couldn't comprehend a world outside its carefully controlled climate. She saw my drab clothes and quiet demeanor as simply the way things were. She was the sun, I was the earth she grew from. It was the natural order of our universe, and she was too busy basking in the warmth to question the cost of its creation. For years I went along with it. I buried my own desires, my own wit, my own love for vibrant colors and lively debate, under layers of gray wool and polite silence. I did it for peace. I did it because I was taught that my role was to support my sister, that her success was the family's success. But resentment is a seed. And even in the most barren soil, with enough time and watering, it will eventually begin to grow. A quiet rebellion was taking root in the hidden corners of my heart, waiting for the right moment to break through the surface. The arrival of Duke Walter Easton into the social sphere was like a sudden, brilliant comet. He was everything the ambitious mothers of the ton dreamed of, titled wealthy beyond measure, handsome, and, most importantly, unmarried. My mother, Lady Beatrice, spoke his name with a reverence usually reserved for prayer. He was not merely a good match, he was the match. Securing him for Cassandra became her life's singular obsession. Our house was thrown into a frenzy of preparation. Dress fittings for Cassandra lasted for days. Menus were planned for hypothetical dinners she might one day host, and conversation topics that the Duke was rumored to enjoy were drilled into her like multiplication tables. My role in this grand campaign was, as always, peripheral and practical. I was the one who ran to the modiste to fetch a forgotten swatch of lace. I was the one who spent an hour polishing Cassandra's dancing slippers until they shone. I was the one who had to sit and listen as my mother and sister debated the strategic advantage of pearls over diamonds, offering the occasional, "Yes, that looks lovely, Cassandra," when prompted. I felt like a ghost haunting the edges of my own life, watching others live with a vibrancy I was forbidden to possess. The breaking point didn't come with a crash of thunder, but in a quiet, overheard whisper. My mother was hosting tea for some of her closest confidantes, a coven of similarly ambitious matriarchs. I was pouring the tea, my movements silent and practiced, when Lady Pomfrey, a woman with a face like a startled pug, gestured towards me with her cup. "And what of your younger daughter, Beatrice? Will she be making her debut soon?" My mother let out a soft, dismissive laugh, a sound that pricked my skin like 1,000 tiny needles. "Oh, Annalise," she said, as if the idea was absurd. "Heavens, no. She's the quiet one. A wonderful companion for Cassandra, of course. Keeps her grounded. She's not one for the spotlight, you see. Perfectly content with her books and her embroidery. The casual cruelty of it stole the air from my lungs. Perfectly content. It wasn't just a lie, it was an erasure. She had written my story for me, a tale of a dull, passionless girl who was happy in her cage because she didn't know the sky existed. In that moment, the seed of resentment that had been quietly growing within me finally broke through the soil, unfurling into a vine of pure, righteous anger. I was not content. I was suffocating. That evening, the announcement came. The Duke was hosting the annual Midsummer Masquerade Ball at his own palatial estate. It was the most exclusive, most anticipated event of the season. For my mother, this was the grand stage for Cassandra's final triumphant performance. For me, it was a spark in the darkness, a masquerade, a place where faces were hidden, a place where for a few precious hours you could be anyone you wanted to be. The next day I slipped out of the house on the pretense of fetching some medicinal herbs from the apothecary. Instead, I made my way to a small, unassuming cottage on the edge of the city, the home of Mrs. Gable. She had been my grandmother's personal seamstress, a woman with hands that could spin magic from thread and a spirit that had never been cowed by rank or title. After my grandmother's passing, she had retired, but we had maintained a quiet friendship, a small link to a woman who had loved me for who I was, not for what I could do for my sister. I found her in her garden, tending to her roses. I didn't have a plan, not really. I just needed to tell someone, to let the poison of my mother's words out before it consumed me entirely. I told her everything, the years of enforced plainness, the constant suppression, and the conversation I had overheard. My voice cracked with a hurt so deep I had forgotten its shape. She listened patiently, her sharp, clever eyes never leaving my face. When I was finished, she didn't offer platitudes or sympathies. She simply snipped a perfect white rose from its stem, pruned its thorns, and handed it to me. "Well," she said, her voice crisp and practical, "it seems to me that if they want you to be a ghost, the least we can do is give them a spectacular haunting." A slow smile spread across her face, and it was in that moment that the idea, wild and terrifying and beautiful, was born. "The Duke's ball," she whispered, her eyes gleaming with a conspiratorial light. "A mask. My dear Annalise, is a powerful thing. It hides a face, yes, but sometimes it gives a soul the courage to show itself." The days that followed were a whirlwind of clandestine activity. Mrs. Gable's small cottage became my secret sanctuary, a world away from the oppressive grays of Thorn Manor. From a heavy cedar chest, she unearthed a treasure she had been saving for decades, a bolt of silk the color of a midnight sky, shot through with threads of silver that shimmered like captured starlight. It was a color I had only dreamed of wearing, a direct violation of my mother's decree. Just touching it felt like an act of defiance. "This was meant for a queen who never was," Mrs. Gable said, draping the fabric over my shoulders. "I think it's finally found its rightful owner." We worked in secret, fueled by tea and shared rebellion. While at home, I was fetching and mending Cassandra's pale pinks and frothy whites for the ball. In the afternoons, I was standing on a stool in Mrs. Gable's sewing room, being pinned and fitted for a gown that felt more like armor than clothing. It was a masterpiece of elegant simplicity. The gown had a modest neckline but fell off the shoulders just enough to be daring. The bodice was fitted to perfection, and the skirt flowed like liquid night, unadorned by the fussy ribbons and lace that were so in fashion. Its beauty was in its color, its cut, and the way it moved. It was a dress that didn't scream for attention. It commanded it with a confident whisper. While Mrs. Gable worked her magic with the needle, my own transformation was happening from the inside out. She taught me how to stand, not with the apologetic slump I had perfected, but with my shoulders back and my head held high. "Your spine is not a question mark, child," she would chide gently. "It is an exclamation point." We practiced walking, not with the shuffling, unobtrusive steps of a companion, but with a graceful, deliberate stride. We even practiced conversation. She would pretend to be a lord or a diplomat, asking me my opinions on art, on politics, on the state of the world, all the things I was forbidden to discuss at home. At first, my voice was hesitant, my thoughts clumsy from disuse, but slowly, with her encouragement, the real Annalise began to emerge, blinking in the unfamiliar light. The final piece was the mask. We found it in a small, dusty antique shop. It was a delicate silver filigree creation that covered only the eyes, adorned with tiny glittering sapphires at the temples. It was perfect. It would hide my identity but not my expression. The night of the ball arrived, thick with anticipation. I helped Cassandra dress, my fingers surprisingly steady as I fastened the buttons on her pale rose gown. She was a vision of conventional beauty, a perfect English rose. "You look beautiful, Cass," I said, and I meant it. There was no malice in my heart towards her, only a deep, aching sadness for the system that had pitted us against each other. "Thank you, Annie," she said, preening in the mirror. She glanced at my drab brown dress. "It's a shame you aren't coming, but I suppose you wouldn't enjoy it much anyway." I just smiled. "Have a wonderful time." After my family departed in their carriage, a flurry of pink silk and anxious commands from my mother, I began my own preparations. I slipped out the back gate and ran to Mrs. Gable's cottage. There, my midnight gown was waiting. I let my hair down from its punishing bun, and Mrs. Gable brushed it out until it fell in soft, dark waves over my shoulders. I took off the hated glasses, tucking them into my reticule like a discarded identity. When I finally put on the mask and looked in the mirror, I didn't recognize the woman staring back. She was not the meek, plain Annalise Thorne. She was a stranger, full of mystery and possibility. Her eyes, no longer hidden, seemed darker, deeper. She looked powerful. I arrived at the Easton estate in a hired carriage, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The ballroom was a breathtaking spectacle of light and sound, with chandeliers like captured constellations dripping crystals from the ceiling. The air buzzed with music, laughter, and the rustle of 1,000 gowns. I paused at the top of the grand staircase, a lone figure in midnight blue amidst a sea of pastels. As I descended, I felt a change in the atmosphere. Conversations lulled, heads turned. A wave of whispers followed me down the stairs. "Who is she?" "I've never seen her before. Look at that gown." For the first time in my life, I was not invisible. I was the center of attention, and it was both terrifying and exhilarating. Duke Walter Easton was precisely as handsome as the rumors claimed, but he looked profoundly bored. He stood near a marble column, a polite, weary smile fixed on his face as he endured an endless parade of hopeful debutantes and their determined mothers. I watched as my own sister Cassandra was presented to him. She executed a flawless curtsy and offered him a well-rehearsed compliment. He responded with impeccable courtesy, his eyes betraying nothing but a kind of resigned duty. He was a man drowning in a sea of superficiality. Then his eyes lifted and scanned the room, and for a moment they met mine. The polite smile faltered, a flicker of genuine curiosity, of interest crossed his features. He excused himself from the group he was with and began to move through the crowd, his gaze never leaving me. He moved with a purpose that made my breath catch in my throat. He stopped before me and gave a slight bow. "I do not believe we've had the pleasure," he said, his voice a low, pleasant baritone. "Forgive my forwardness, but I must know who you are." I curtsied, my body remembering Mrs. Gable's lessons. "And where would be the fun in that, Your Grace?" I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "Tonight I am simply Astra, a name I had plucked from the stars, a nod to my secret love of astronomy." He was taken aback, then a genuine smile, the first I had seen all night, touched his lips. "Astra," he repeated softly. "The Lady of the Stars, it suits you. You seem to have fallen from another world into this one." He gestured to the dance floor. "Would you do me the honor, Astra?" As he led me onto the floor, I could feel the stares of everyone in the room, most acutely those of my mother and sister. I could imagine their shock, their fury, but as Walter's hand rested on my waist and the music swelled around us, they melted away. There was only him. We danced, and we talked. He didn't ask about my family or my lineage. He asked what I thought of the music, and I told him I found the waltz beautiful but melancholic. He asked what I did with my days, and instead of saying I embroidered, I told him I read books on celestial navigation. His eyes lit up. "A fellow stargazer," he said with delight. "Tell me, what do you think of Cassini's latest theories on the rings of Saturn?" And just like that, we were no longer a duke and a mystery woman. We were two people sharing a passion. The conversation flowed as easily as the wine, touching on poetry, philosophy, and our dreams for a life that was more than just a series of social obligations. I spoke with a freedom I had never known, my long dormant opinions and ideas tumbling out. He listened, truly listened, with an intensity that made me feel like I was the only person in the universe. He was witty, intelligent, and possessed a surprising depth beneath his ducal exterior. For the first time I felt seen, truly seen for the mind and spirit my family had tried so hard to hide. We danced a second time and then a third. I saw Cassandra watching from the sidelines, her expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. My mother looked as though she had swallowed a hornet. They had no idea who I was. To them, I was just some audacious stranger, a rival who had appeared from nowhere to sabotage their perfect plan. As the clock on the mantelpiece neared midnight, a painful reality set in. My time in this fairy tale was running out. I couldn't risk being here when the masks came off. I had to disappear as mysteriously as I had arrived. I must go, I said softly, pulling away from him reluctantly. So soon? Walter asked, his hand tightening slightly on mine. But I don't even know your name. How will I find you? Perhaps you're not meant to, I replied, a genuine pang of sadness in my voice. I gave him a small, final curtsy. Thank you for the dance, Your Grace. It was more than you could possibly know. Before he could protest further, I turned and slipped into the crowd, my dark dress making it easy to melt into the shadows. I fled the ballroom, my heart soaring and breaking all at once, leaving the Duke of Easton with nothing but the memory of a conversation, a midnight blue dress, and the name of a star. The following morning, Thorn Manor was electric with a kind of furious energy. The sole topic of conversation was the audacious mystery woman who had so thoroughly captivated Duke Easton. My mother paced the breakfast room like a caged lioness, her face a mask of indignation. Cassandra sat slumped in her chair, pushing a piece of toast around her plate with a sullen expression. It was an outrage, my mother declared to the room at large, some foreign nobody, no doubt, utterly shameless, monopolizing the Duke's attention all evening. He didn't dance with another soul after she arrived. Her gown was quite striking, though, Cassandra mumbled into her teacup, a hint of grudging admiration in her voice. And they seemed to be talking a lot. Nonsense, Mother snapped. He was merely being polite. He was likely trapped by her forwardness. I sat at my corner of the table, dressed in my customary drab gray, my hair pulled back so tightly it ached. I kept my eyes downcast, sipping my tea, a tiny secret smile playing on my lips. I was a ghost at my own banquet, listening to them dissect a version of me they could never comprehend. The city's gossip columns that afternoon were even more thrilling. They were filled with breathless speculation about the Duke's new obsession. They dubbed her the Lady of the Stars, a woman of unparalleled beauty and intellect who had vanished into the night, leaving the season's most eligible bachelor utterly bewitched. The search, they claimed, was on. Duke Walter was nothing if not determined. His search for Astra was subtle but relentless. He hosted small informal gatherings, hoping she might reappear. He made inquiries through his network of friends. But of course no one knew a debutante who matched her description, for she didn't exist. The mystery only seemed to fuel his fascination. A week after the ball, my mother, through sheer force of will, managed to secure an invitation for us to a garden party at the estate of a marquess known to be a close friend of the Duke's. Cassandra was prepped for this second chance, as if for battle. Her dress was the color of spring lilacs, her bonnet was festooned with silk flowers, and her lines had been rehearsed. I was, as usual, her shadow, in a particularly uninspired beige dress that blended perfectly with the gravel pathways. We found the Duke near a rose garden, looking handsome but distracted, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd. He greeted my mother and Cassandra with his customary flawless politeness, his gaze sweeping over me with barely a flicker of recognition. But then, as my mother launched into a long-winded story, I found myself staring at a particular bloom, a deep crimson rose with a complex petal structure. The Étoile de Hollande, I murmured, more to myself than anyone else. It's rare to see one so perfectly formed. The Duke's head snapped towards me. My voice, it was soft, as I had been trained. but the cadence, the rhythm of the words, it was familiar. He looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time. "You know of roses, Miss Thorne?" I flushed, realizing I had broken my cardinal rule. Be silent. My grandmother was an avid gardener, I stammered, my eyes dropping to the ground. She taught me a little. He dismissed the thought, a frown creasing his brow. It was impossible. This plain, painfully shy woman could not be the witty, confident creature from the ball. And yet, the seed of an idea was planted. He was polite to Cassandra, listening to her talk about the weather and a recent shopping trip, but his attention seemed to wander. A few minutes later, he found a way to steer the conversation towards literature, a topic he now knew was of interest to Astra. "I was just reading a fascinating new translation of Ovid," he said, watching my face carefully. "The passages on transformation are particularly insightful." Cassandra smiled blankly. "How interesting, Your Grace." He turned to me. "And you, Miss Thorne? Are you a fan of the classics?" I froze. It was a test. The real Annalise, the one who spent her nights devouring books by candlelight, wanted to leap into a detailed discussion. The false Annalise, the one my mother had created, was supposed to be ignorant. I, I'm afraid I don't have much time for reading, Your Grace," I lied, hating the way the words tasted in my mouth. His expression was one of faint disappointment, yet the perplexity remained. He felt that spark, that ghost of an intellectual connection he'd had with Astra, but my appearance and my demeanor were a constant, powerful contradiction. He spent the rest of the afternoon being a perfect gentleman to Cassandra, but I caught him watching me from across the lawn more than once, his eyes narrowed in thought. This strange, frustrating dance continued over the next several weeks at a series of social engagements. At the opera, Cassandra commented on the soprano's gown. The Duke, after a moment, turned to the quiet figure standing behind her chair. "And what did you think of the performance, Miss Thorne?" he asked, his voice low. Forgetting myself for a moment, I let my true feelings show. "I thought the conductor's tempo in the third act was a bit rushed," I said softly. It lost some of the emotional weight of the lovers' parting. He stared at me, his eyes wide with shock. It was a nuanced, insightful critique. It was exactly the kind of observation Astra would have made. He looked from me, in my dull brown dress and severe hair, to Cassandra, who was fanning herself and looking bored, and the confusion on his face was palpable. My mother noticed the exchange, and her lips thinned into a white line. On the carriage ride home, she turned on me. "What do you think you are doing?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "The Duke is not speaking to you out of interest. He is speaking to you out of pity, because you look like a frightened mouse. Your job is to be silent, to stand there and make your sister look accomplished by comparison. Do not distract him with your dreary little opinions ever again. Am I understood?" "Yes, Mother," I whispered, shrinking back into my seat. The encounters grew more charged. At a gallery opening, he found me standing transfixed before a dark, moody landscape by a little-known artist, while Cassandra held court by the more popular, brightly colored portraits. "Not to your taste, Your Grace?" I asked, assuming he would prefer the more fashionable works. "On the contrary," he said, standing beside me. "I find this piece more honest than any other in the room. Why does it capture your attention, Miss Thorne?" And I told him. I spoke of the artist's use of shadow and light, the sense of lonely resilience in the twisted branches of the single tree. I spoke with a passion I couldn't contain, and as I did, I saw the dawning realization in his eyes. This was her. This was Astra's soul, somehow trapped inside this plain little sparrow. The more he sought me out, the more suspicious and resentful my family became. Cassandra, who had always treated me with a sort of benign neglect, now saw me as a threat. "I don't understand why he keeps talking to you," she said petulantly one evening. "You're so dull." The words, meant to wound, had the opposite effect. They were proof that my disguise was working, even as it was failing in the one place that mattered. My own heart was a battlefield. I was dizzy with the thrill of his attention, of being seen and appreciated by this remarkable man for my true self. But I was also racked with guilt over the deception and terrified of the inevitable discovery. He was falling for Annalise, not Astra, but he didn't yet know they were one and the same. How could I ever unravel this tangled web I had woven? The final thread came loose at a riverside picnic. It was a beautiful day, and for a short while the atmosphere was relaxed. Under the guise of fetching me a glass of lemonade, Walter drew me away from the main group. We found ourselves standing by the water's edge, and he began to speak of poetry. He quoted a line from a rather obscure sonnet about the constellations. Without thinking, my love for the words overriding my caution, I finished the stanza for him. And in her eyes a universe I'd trace, where stars align to grant a moment's grace. Silence. A profound, ringing silence. It was the very same poem we had discussed on the night of the ball. Walter went perfectly still. He looked at me, and this time there was no confusion in his eyes. There was only dawning certainty. He looked over at Cassandra, who was laughing loudly with a group of officers, a perfect picture of social grace, and then his gaze returned to me, piercing through my carefully constructed facade. "Miss Thorne," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "That poem, it's not widely known. Where did you first hear it?" Panic seized me, cold and absolute. My mind went blank. I I must have read it somewhere, I stammered, my voice trembling. I have a poor memory for sources. It was a weak, transparent lie, and we both knew it. His eyes, full of hurt and suspicion, searched my face. He was looking for her, for Astra, and in my panic she had vanished, leaving only the frightened, meek Annalise in her place. "Forgive me," I whispered, turning away abruptly. "I feel unwell. I must get some air." I fled, my heart pounding a frantic retreat, leaving him standing by the river, holding the final piece of the puzzle in his hand. The game was over. I knew, with a terrible certainty, that a reckoning was coming. The final grand event of the social season was a charity benefit held at the Duke's own city residence, Easton House. It was the culmination of everything, the last stage for the season's dramas to play out. For my mother, it was the final battlefield. She was convinced that the Duke's strange interest in me was a bizarre form of charity, and she decided, in her infinite cunning, to use it to her advantage. Her plan was as cruel as it was simple. "Annalise," she instructed me the day of the benefit, her eyes cold and calculating. "Tonight you will wear the gray muslin, the one with the unfortunate neckline. And I want you to look particularly tired. It will make you seem more pathetic. When the Duke speaks to you, as he is bound to do out of his misplaced sense of pity, Cassandra will create a small, delicate scene. Perhaps she will stumble or feel faint. He will rush to her side, the gallant hero, and the contrast between her fragile beauty and your drabness will be inescapable. It will remind him where his attention truly belongs." I felt sick. She wasn't just using me as a backdrop anymore. She was actively weaponizing my supposed plainness to humiliate me. Cassandra, to her discredit, went along with the plan too, caught up in her own desperation to see its inherent cruelty. But the Duke had a plan of his own. Walter, now all but certain of my identity, was done with games. He needed to force the truth into the light, not for his own satisfaction, but I think to free me. He had arranged for a portion of the evening's entertainment to be a literary trivia game. The grand prize was a small, beautifully bound book of poetry, the very collection that contained the sonnet we both knew so well. And to help him host, he enlisted his aunt, the Dowager Duchess of Blackwood, a formidable woman with a razor-sharp wit and a famous intolerance for social artifice. The benefit was a glittering affair. I felt like a gray moth amidst a kaleidoscope of butterflies. I did as my mother instructed, standing silently in Cassandra's shadow, feeling the weight of 100 gazes that slid right over me. When the literary game was announced, a nervous energy filled the room. The Duke and his aunt took their places at the front. The questions began. They were clever and challenging, touching on everything from Shakespeare to modern philosophy. Cassandra, relying on the surface level education my mother had provided, offered a few vapid, incorrect guesses before falling silent, a blush of embarrassment creeping up her neck. I stood behind her, my heart a heavy stone in my chest, knowing the answers to nearly every question, but bound by my mother's command to be invisible. Finally, the last question came. The Duke's eyes found mine across the crowded room. "For the grand prize," he announced, his voice clear and resonant, "can anyone identify the author of the sonnet that begins, 'We built our castles on the shifting sand and called them kingdoms for a single day'?" A deep silence fell over the guests. It was the opening line of the obscure poem about constellations. No one moved. No one spoke. The Duke's gaze held mine, and it wasn't a challenge, it was an invitation, a plea. My mother, sensing the shift in dynamics, shot me a look of pure venom, a silent, furious command, "Do not speak." Beside me, Cassandra whispered, her voice tight with panic, "Don't you dare, Annalise." But I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at Walter. And in his eyes I saw that he knew everything. He wasn't trying to expose me. He was trying to rescue me. He was offering me a choice: remain a prisoner in the role my family had created, or step into the light and claim my own story. I took a shaky breath, the first truly free breath I had taken in years. I straightened my spine, remembering Mrs. Gable's words. It was not a question mark. It was an exclamation point. My voice, when it came, was not the meek whisper of Annalise the companion. It was the clear, steady voice of Astra. "The author is Arthur Jones," I said, my voice carrying through the silent room, "a little-known poet from the last century." I paused, then continued, my gaze locked with Walter's. "The next stanza is, 'But you, my north, my constant and my guide, saw through the dusk where truer stars did hide.'" A collective gasp swept through the room. The name, however, that caused the real shock came from the Duke himself. He smiled, a slow, brilliant, triumphant smile that reached his eyes. He picked up the prize book and walked through the stunned crowd, stopping directly in front of me. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, his voice soft but audible to everyone. "Astra." The name hung in the air like a crack of lightning. Cassandra's jaw dropped. My mother's face went from pale to ashen. The guests erupted in a cacophony of whispers as the puzzle pieces clicked into place all at once. The mysterious Lady of the Stars, the woman the Duke had been searching for all season, was the plain, invisible companion to Cassandra Thorne. My hand trembled as I reached out to take the book. Then, in a single decisive movement, I lifted my other hand to my face and removed the glasses. It was a simple act, but it was everything. Without the thick, ugly frames obscuring my features, with my head held high and my eyes clear, the illusion was shattered. The room fell silent again, seeing me for the very first time. My mother found her voice first, and it was a shriek of pure, undiluted fury. "What is the meaning of this?" "Annalise, you conniving, deceitful girl. You have deliberately sabotaged your own sister. You schemed to ruin everything." Her accusations rained down on me, but they felt distant, like the ravings of a stranger. For the first time, her words had no power over me. I turned to face her, my newfound calm a stark contrast to her hysteria. "No, Mother," I said, my voice ringing with a strength I never knew I possessed. "You are the one who has been deceiving everyone. You tried to hide me because you were afraid. You dressed me in gray and tried to silence my thoughts, but you cannot hide a person's soul. The Duke wasn't captivated by a mask or a midnight blue gown. He was captivated by a conversation, by a meeting of minds, something you never ever allowed me to have. I turned back to Walter, my heart in my eyes. "I do apologize for the deception, Your Grace," I said sincerely. "It was born not of malice, but of desperation. I only wanted a few hours of freedom." Before he could reply, Walter stepped forward, moving to stand beside me, a silent, unshakable declaration of allegiance. He faced my mother, his expression unwritable but his authority absolute. Then he turned his attention to the assembled guests. "For weeks," he announced, his voice filling the grand room, "I have been searching for a woman I met at my masquerade. A woman of breathtaking intelligence, uncommon wit, and a deeply passionate heart. I found her that night, and I have found her again every single time I have had the pleasure of speaking with Miss Annalise Thorne." He turned back to me, his eyes full of a warmth that melted the last of my fear. He gently took my hand. "The mask you wore was beautiful," he said, "for my ears only. But Annalise, you yourself are dazzling." The fallout from that night was immediate and spectacular. My mother, Cassandra, and I did not so much leave the party as flee from it, pursued by a tidal wave of scandalized whispers. Thorn Manor became a fortress under siege, but the enemy was humiliation, and its attacks were relentless. The story was on the lips of everyone in the city, how Lady Beatrice's carefully constructed scheme had imploded, how the diamond she had polished was revealed to be glass, and how the daughter she had hidden was the true gem. The Duke, for his part, wasted no time. The very next day, a magnificent bouquet of white roses the kind Mrs. Gable grew arrived for me, followed by the Duke's own carriage. His courtship of Annalise Thorne began not in secret, but in the full, unforgiving light of public scrutiny. We were seen walking in the park, our heads bent together in conversation. We attended the theater, and he listened to my critiques of the performance with a delighted smile. We visited museums, standing before the very paintings we had once discussed under such different circumstances. He was not just courting me, he was validating me, showing the world and my family that it was me he wanted, the real me, without any masks or pretenses. I could not stay at Thorn Manor. The air was thick with my mother's silent rage and Cassandra's tearful accusations. The day after the benefit, I packed a small bag with my few belongings, left the gray dresses folded in my wardrobe like a shed skin, and walked out the front door. I went to the only place I knew I would be safe, Mrs. Gable's cottage. She welcomed me with a hug and a hot cup of tea, her eyes shining with pride. Her humble home, with its scent of baking bread and roses, became my sanctuary. It was there, away from the prying eyes of society, that Walter and I truly fell in love. He would visit in the afternoons, and we would sit in her small sunlit garden, reading poetry to each other, debating philosophy, and simply learning the final, hidden pieces of each other's souls. He seemed to love me most in those moments, when I was wearing a simple cotton day dress, my hair unbound, and my hated glasses nowhere in sight. My mother's reaction was predictable. A series of letters began to arrive. The first were frantic, demanding I return home at once. The next were accusatory, blaming me for the family's social ruin. The final ones were pleading, begging me to use my influence with the Duke to somehow salvage the situation, perhaps by convincing him to take an interest in Cassandra after all. It was so transparently self-serving that I couldn't even feel anger, only a profound pity. I burned each letter without reply. One afternoon, there was a knock on Mrs. Gable's door. It was Cassandra. She stood on the doorstep, stripped of her usual finery, her eyes red-rimmed and her expression a tangled mess of jealousy, anger, and confusion. "You stole him from me," she accused, her voice raw. "He was meant for me. Everything was planned." I led her into the small sitting room and poured her a cup of tea, my hand steady. I couldn't steal something that was never yours to have, Cass. I said gently. He never truly saw you. And it wasn't because you aren't beautiful or charming, it's because he wasn't allowed to see you. He was only ever shown a perfect doll, programmed by mother to say and do the right things. You were playing a role just as I was. I looked at her, my heart aching with a sudden, sharp empathy. The only difference is, my role was a lie I was forced into. Yours was a lie you chose to embrace. Have you ever once asked yourself what you actually want, apart from what mother wants for you? The question struck her like a physical blow. The anger in her eyes dissolved, replaced by a dawning, terrible understanding. She saw the truth of it. She was as much a victim of our mother's ambition as I was. She had just been kept in a prettier cage. She left that day in tears, but they were different tears. They were not the tears of a spoiled child who had lost a prize, but the tears of a woman beginning to realize she had lost herself. A seed of doubt about our mother and about her own life had finally been planted. A few months later, Walter took me to the botanical gardens, to the very rose bushes where he had first felt a glimmer of recognition. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over everything. He didn't make a grand speech or get down on one knee in a dramatic gesture. He simply turned to me, his eyes full of a deep and steady love, and took my hands in his. I spent a month searching for Astra, he said softly, but I have spent the last 3 months falling in love with Annalise. I have no interest in marrying a duchess or a society belle or a mysterious woman from a ball. I want to marry the woman who knows the names of the stars and feels the sorrow in a waltz. I want to marry you, Annalise Thorne. The real you. Will you be my wife? Through happy tears, I accepted. My life, which had been a cramped, colorless room, suddenly expanded into an infinite, sunlit vista. Just before the wedding, a letter arrived. The handwriting was Cassandra's. It was not a demand or an accusation, but an apology. A genuine, painful, and beautifully written apology. She wrote that our conversation had opened her eyes, that she had begun to push back against our mother's suffocating control for the first time in her life. She was rediscovering her own interests, her own thoughts. She was terrified, but she was also hopeful. At the end of the letter, in a hesitant postscript, she asked if she might come to the wedding. Not as the diamond of the season, not as the jilted sister, but simply as Annalise's sister. I wrote back immediately with a single word. Yes. Our wedding was not the massive society event it could have been. It was an intimate, elegant affair filled with people who genuinely cared for us. Annalise Thorne, the invisible girl, walked down the aisle in a gown of creamy ivory silk, a color of my own choosing. Mrs. Gable sat in the front row, weeping softly into a lace handkerchief. And standing near the back, looking on with a quiet, supportive smile, was Cassandra. My mother was not invited. Her scheme had backfired so completely that she had rendered herself irrelevant. In her desperate grasp for social elevation, she had lost everything that truly mattered. A year later, I was no longer just Annalise Thorne, or even just the Duchess of Easton. I had found my purpose. With Walter's enthusiastic support, I established a foundation dedicated to providing education for young women from families of modest means, ensuring they would have the tools to find their own voices far earlier than I had found mine. I became a patron of the arts and sciences, hosting salons where poets, astronomers, and philosophers could gather and debate freely. Our home was filled not with the stifling silence of my youth, but with the vibrant, chaotic, and beautiful sound of ideas. Walter and I were a true partnership, built on a foundation of mutual respect and endless conversation. He was my north, my constant, and my guide, and I hope, was his. In the end, the drab clothes and the unflattering glasses, The severe hair and the enforced silence, none of it could truly hide who I was. My family thought they were burying me, but they didn't realize they had planted a seed. The mask I wore that night didn't create a new person, it just gave the real one permission to finally step into the light. My story is about finding the courage to remove the masks that others force upon us and to trust that who we are underneath is more than enough. I want to thank you for listening to my story today. It's not always easy to revisit these memories, but it's important. So many of us are given roles to play that don't fit our souls. Share your story in the comments below. Have you ever had to fight to be seen for who you truly are? Reading your experiences gives strength to so many others in this community. And if this story resonated with you, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories of resilience and finding your own way. Remember that your value is not determined by how others see you, but by the truth you hold within yourself. Thank you for joining me on this journey.